JavaScript strings are something that we have looked at already. Now, there are a few interesting differences in strings that we haven't covered already. So what we want to do in this lesson is just take you through, again, the string literal syntax like we did with numbers, and also the function and the constructor syntax of strings. And much of what we're doing here is very familiar with all of these concepts. They're familiar with numbers, they're familiar with strings, booleans, and so on. Most of these objects have a literal syntax. They have a function and a constructor syntax. So it only makes sense that we dive in and look through all of them. Now, before we do, let's go and get started with the one that we've looked at already. Throughout this course, we've investigated things such as 55 pixels, and this is in fact a number inside of a string. Now, for this example, let's take pizza as an item that we would like to put inside of a string, just the simple name of a pizza. Now, all we're doing here is defining a word inside of these quotes, and we haven't really talked about what would happen if we put something outside of the quotes. So let's do exactly that and watch everything explode in the console. So you can see here that we have pizza is not defined. Now, that's obvious because we have nothing defined called pizza. So this is something that we would like to put inside of a string. Now, a string can contain absolutely anything that you want it to. I mean, we could add lots of numbers, we could add words, and strings can contain absolutely anything. Now, that's the first way that we've defined a string, and you'll notice this little character here, that single quote. Now, we can optionally use a double quote. Now, because I am using prettier, this will in fact change things over as I hit save, but this is a perfectly valid string literal. Much like a number literal being something like 99, a string literal is defined in between these quotes, and they can be single or they can be double. Now, when I hit save, this is going to change this out, so we'll just see the word pizza twice, and it replaces my double string marks with single quotes. Now, just to confirm to you that this does absolutely work, pizza is completely valid as it is when we use a double string approach. So why might we have two different ways to do the same thing? Now, there might be specific use cases where we want to change this over to a double quote, and then inside we might have a single quote. So we could put hello inside of a single quote, and you can see prettier doesn't actually change these back to single quotes because this would interfere with what is happening inside of here, because it looks like we have a string inside a string when really it's just a string with some quotations inside. So a good question that you may be asking is, what happens next when we do something like this? So already we're seeing some kind of syntax error, and here it says unexpected token hello. Now, this is because we're trying to create one string here, and really there's no beginning or end to the next string. So this hello is just floating around with this exclamation mark followed by some more quotes. So this piece here is in fact another string, and then in between it is some invalid code. So if we did want to have a string inside of a string, we used a backslash, and this is called escaping. So here we can have a single quote inside of a single quote. We can also do the same with double quotes as well. It's not just tied to single quotes. Now, if we did do something like this, when I hit save, Prettier likes to keep one consistent formatting. So you can see over here that we're keeping those double quotes inside the string, but to define the string, which in my opinion makes much more sense, we can use just a single quote. Okay, so that's number one out of the way. We know how to use single quotes, we can use double quotes, we can use singles inside of singles and doubles inside of doubles, and so forth. But if you do decide to do that, just remember that we need to escape them. Now, the next technique is really interesting. So here we're going to say pizza, and we're going to give it a name of pepperoni. Now, what we're going to do in this next console log is use something called a backtick. Now you can see this comes up orange instead of yellow, and it's only a subtle color difference, but it means that it's an ES 2015 or ES6 string literal. And with it, these provide much more capability than just a basic string on its own. Now, before we go into too much detail about backticks, let me give you an example. So we could say the pizza is, and then we can add on that pizza at the end. So we can save this and we get pizza is pepperoni. Now, the interesting piece is here, we can have one string and then we're adding another string. Now, this is called string concatenation, where we're merging two different strings and creating one output string as seen in here. Now, with ES 2015 backticks, this becomes much more easy. So here's a backtick and we can say pizza is. Now, instead of jumping out the string, if you want to call it jumping out of the string, we can in fact stay inside of the string. These ES 2015 backticks allow us to use a new syntax, which starts with $, followed by some curly braces. Now you can see as soon as I add the curly braces, this piece turns red and the rest orange. Now, what would happen if I add the word pizza inside and save it out? We now get a much better syntax. We get the same result. However, this allows us to run or pass through JavaScript expressions into a string. So there's no more string concatenation that we might need to do, because think about it, we might have some more strings here where we just simply add an exclamation mark. If I go ahead and save this, you'll see this appears after the word pepperoni. Now within this, we don't have to concatenate another string. We can just simply include it inside of the string. So this new syntax is much more readable, and we also get another benefit from this. You may also hear these as called template literal strings. Now this practice of adding the $, followed by the curly braces, is typically called interpolation, where it provides us an easy way to interpolate variables and expressions straight into the string. Now we haven't touched on functions yet, but functions are something that we could also call if we wanted to call functions inside of a string. So this gives us a really powerful templating technique, and it also gives us added support for multi-line strings. Now, what do we mean by multi-line strings? With a regular string, if we try to add something like this onto a new line, everything breaks for us. The proper syntax would be something like this, where we add the string onto a new line, and we would have to use something like a backslash to denote that we wanted to perhaps put something on the end again. Now, as you can see, things start to look a bit wonky, they look a bit messy. We don't really want to be doing something like this, which is why these ES 2015 template literal strings using the backticks also give us the ability to use multi-line strings. Now it becomes more apparent when we do something like this. We don't see any red underlines at all anywhere inside of our code. So we'll hit save on here. Now, the interesting piece is you can see that the white space is also mirrored on each side from our editor to the developer tools, which gives us an enhanced capability to create what we call multi-line strings. And we'll be using these as we continue out through the course. At the moment, we have just used simple string concatenation, but we're going to be using the multi-line strings as we continue. So what we can do is just remove this a little bit. We'll just keep the nice formatting. But for example, we call these template literals because we might want to interpolate and create some kind of reusable template that gives us perhaps a list item that we might want to iterate over and then create a brand new formatted template literal each time. So with that in mind, what we have covered so far is single quotes, double quotes, and backticks. Backticks you can use if you'd like. We can completely swap this out for backticks if we want. That is perfectly valid JavaScript code. And even if we have these backtick strings, they can absolutely be mixed like we're showing here with a normal quote string. So how the string is composed doesn't matter. They're just different syntaxes to give us essentially the same thing. So now that we have covered the string literal approach, let's have a look at the function syntax with this string object. You can see that it takes any value. And as an example, let's pass in the number 55. Now, we mentioned earlier that the numbers in the DevTools console come up blue. So you can see that this is actually giving us a string representation of the number 55. Now, because it's a function, we could potentially add something and pass through an expression to be evaluated through the function arguments as well. And as an interesting example, we can also do string 55 and we'll add 11 as the string value. Now, can you guess what this is going to give us? If you guessed 5,511, you would be entirely correct. Now you may be thinking, why is this happening? Now, when we try and add a number to a string, they essentially both get converted to a string. So we're kind of concatenating the number which is converted to a string of 55, and then we add another string on of 11. Now, an interesting piece is this, by default, won't actually change. So we could undo this and do 55 plus 11, and we will still see the exact same result. If you're adding a number to a string, the string will always take precedence, and whatever number you have will be converted to a string, and the strings will be concatenated together. Now, that's a real gotcha that a lot of people don't understand or visualize when learning JavaScript. So we'll demonstrate it here in this video for you. Now, it might be that when we get onto the later chapters and you feel more comfortable with JavaScript, that you want to potentially convert other objects to a string. Now, it might not be the best idea in the world, but we could have an object with a value of pepperoni, for example, and we can convert that over to a string. Now, when we looked at the type checking examples earlier, we looked at this object. So what is happening here is the string is calling that .toString method and converting our object to a string. We could also do the same for an array. Now, we haven't looked at objects or an array yet, but this is just to kind of give you an example and familiarize yourself with some of these concepts before we dive too deeply. Now, I can't see too many great examples by converting this object to a string, but it might be somewhat handy to convert an array to a string for potentially parsing at a later date. So this piece just simply demonstrates how we can perform a type conversion on other objects or primitives which are not strings. Now, what I also want to have a look at is this string function with the new keyword in front of it as well. Now, for this, we're not going to expect anything different. We're simply showing you it for completeness. I wouldn't advise that we use any of these approaches or any of these approaches over the string literal syntax. It's just for completeness so we can understand the language in a lot more detail before we continue. So let's save this out and see what we get in the console. Much like when we called new number, we had a number wrapper, and here we have a string wrapper with a primitive value of 55. Now, if you've got some eagle eyes, you'll have seen this 0 with a number of 5 and a 1 with a number of 5. Now, this will lead us in our next video where we're going to talk about accessing what are called properties on this string object. Now, it's not a common thing that you would create your own string objects, but even using a string literal, we can also access those properties as well. One other thing which you may have seen is this length property. Now, we have a length here of 2, and we're going to be talking about this in a bit more detail in the next video where we talk about string properties and indexes, which is all to do with these fancy things which live under the hood of these string objects. But in this video, we've learned about single quotes, double quotes, ES 2015, string literals, multi-line strings, as well as providing expressions so we can interpolate particular values and return them back to a string, such as our pizza is a pepperoni. And we've also looked at the string function and the constructor syntax just to understand. Again, we don't want to be using these in the real world unless we have to perform some kind of type conversion. So that's it for now, and I'll see you in the next video.